I want to refer in my introduction to a talk given at this conference last year. 1 year ago at this conference, Dominic Oldman of the British Museum presented a talk titled Collection Data and Social Justice. This talk showed how to connect the discussion around the social role of museums with social aspects of their databases. He presented us with a critique of commercial collection systems, arguing instead for, I quote, representations of rich, contextualized connections. He argued that new collection systems will not come from software houses, but from the needs of communities. And following this important perspective on museums and data politics, I want to propose to extend this question a bit, to extend it to the question of museum activities on social media, because also in this field, political questions have to be raised. And in fact, I don't see this as two separate debates, ethical aspects of databases on the one hand and ethical aspects of outreach on the other hand. I think in a museum, open data science and digital community work do not have to be separate fields. On the contrary, museums as social heritage institutions can be an exemplary and essential use case for the development of more ethical social technologies. So while these are commonly treated as separate discussions, documentation on the one hand and marketing on the other hand, I want to propose a way to see it as closely related topics. Because in the last years, there's a raising awareness of the problematic influence of the major social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, etc. And I want to connect this criticism with the role of museums. The main idea of my talk is that the internet offers social technologies beyond Google and Facebook. And museums played actually a very important role in shaping the open digital sociality of the web in the 1990s. My argument will draw on this history of museums and the internet, because I believe cultural heritage institutions like museums, library, archives have a very important role in the future of the internet also. So of course, I know that museums are run as enterprises, that they do marketing and are evaluated by commercial success also. And of course, it is fitting that they do their marketing on social media and they try to keep their social media interactive and engaging. But I want to propose a future role of museums in the conflicts around surveillance capitalism. I want to ask the question, if there is still hope for an open internet, an internet that is not about tracking, data extraction, and manipulation of individuals, so an internet beyond Facebook and Google, what role will cultural heritage institutions play in shaping this internet? Let's start with the problems of current social media. The topic of the International Museum Day in May 2020 was Museums for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, referring to the ongoing debate, of course, on the social role of museums beyond acquire, conserve, research, communicate and exhibit, so the ICOM definition debate. But this social theme was overshadowed by one major difference that this Museum Day had. Most museums were in lockdown since 2 months. The existing databases, digital editions, and social media accounts were mobilized for celebrating this day in lockdown. In the end, this meant a lot of events on social media platforms, for example, curator tours as live streams. In many museums in the lockdown, the tours took place in improvised Instagram stories or YouTube videos with the usual commercial breaks like we are used to on the free-to-use servers of the network monopolists, Facebook and Google. Of course, museums are strong users of social media and they follow the trends, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. All this is happening at a time when the big social media platforms are starting to get a somehow bad social reputation. ethical concerns about social media have reached the mainstream cultural and political debate. Just think of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the discussion of political micro-targeting, the Snowden leaks, and, for example, this book by Shoshana Zuboff and publications by others on surveillance, personal data extraction, and behavior manipulation at the core of these big platforms. So I think there is no way around facing the problematic political, ethical, social effects of social media. Museums participating in these platforms must face the debate on the consequences of this participation. This should be really common sense. What this talk wants to offer is a further proposal to them, to museums in general, to take a role in shaping a future social web beyond the data extraction platforms like Facebook, Instagram, or the corporate so-called metaverse under construction. We have become accustomed to the idea that the internet is somehow it feels like a money-free zone with endless feeds of free content. And we tend to ignore the fact that our emotional reactions, social relations, and behavior has become the main source of wealth extraction there. We finance all these free services like Google Mail, Google Docs, Facebook Feed, Facebook Messenger, Instagram Feed, by giving access to our affects, to our movement, to our relationships. Tracking aspects of our private, public, and sometimes even inner life has become the most advanced manipulation machine. For the first time in history, everyone's reaction to commercial and political advertising can be directly measured and tuned. So a cultural institution creating attractive and engaging content on these platforms is supporting them, not the other way around. The platform always wins. They get to use the data of your audience, not you. So what could be the shape of a different social web, and what role do museums have in its conceptualization? In a paper titled The Future Social Web from 2013, philosopher Yuk Hul and data scientist Harry Halpin summarized the problems of the platforms based on tracking, extraction of personal data, and micro-targeted advertising. What is important for our debate here is the terminology of a future social web they present. While they affirm the need for a very social internet with elaborate communication channels, which led to the success of the current social media platforms, they try to sketch out the shape of future networks beyond the current economic models. So I quote from their paper, "A collective social networking is possible and is one based on the revealing of ourselves and our being in the world of others, the group based around a common project or calling." One aspect of their paper is that the future social web will be based on exchanging different alternative social technologies. Quote, "By creating a new technical substrate influenced by open standards that are based on this conception of groups, different alternatives can exchange and make elements of their social networks communicable in terms of protocols, data portability, and especially conceptualizations." So for me, the presentation by Dominic Oldman last year at this conference was such a presentation of network conceptualization. So how can we talk further about social network concepts connected to museums? Are there any? The paper on the future social web is already from 2013. And as we all know, cultural institutions did not get behind these goals in their social media work, at least, but instead took part in contributing to the main monopolistic networks like Facebook and Instagram. The idea of the future social web still sounds so promising a decade later because it opens a cultural perspective on alternatives. Not centralization versus decentralization, but the current model of personalized feeds, posts, and comments versus other forms of communication and collaboration. And I find this very important because cultural heritage institutions don't even fit that well into the feed world. Museums are important data producers. They digitize their collection items, publish metadata about them, and produce and document research data. In the feeds and posts of social networks, a completely different logic prevails. There we speak of data silos that house their own digital objects separated from the rest of the internet technologically, without a possibility of precise description and links. So we can, of course, we can share a Facebook post, but it cannot contain any information beyond Facebook's predefined input fields. So these defaults do not fit cultural data, as they are specifically designed to capture people, namely their location, emotions, biometric characteristics, etc. And I would say these factors cause a certain powerlessness of museums in this terrain. Their own digital infrastructure, like collection databases, are geared to their own purposes and are also discussed continuously and developed. In social media, on the other hand, museums are trying to find their way and their voice in an area that is far removed from their other standards. So when it comes to making one's own cultural data accessible, to circulate it and talk about it, the major social media platforms are not really fitting. This leads to a break between the museum's digital objective, like digital collecting and mediation, and its mediation practice when it takes place in social media. So what's important for me at this point is to say cultural institutions and their data represent the big potential of open digital formats and open standards. There's actually a long and fruitful debate in museums around crowd knowledge, participation, open standards, and interfaces. A lot of this seems to be thrown overboard once museums open a social media account. But this also means that the history of digital collections and digital community work in museums forms a very good foundation to actually contribute to the debate on other forms of social media. So when Yuk Hul and Harry Halpin argued in 2013 that the forms of interaction and data extraction of the social media platforms have toxic social effects, they didn't stop at this criticism. They also proposed principles and goals for the future social web. How can museums be part of such an open future social web where other digital modes of connection and collectivity are at the center? The museum technology world is actually good at what you and Halpin are describing, namely sharing data, sharing code, discussing the social implications of code when it comes to the collection system and collection representation in, for example, generous interfaces. I want to now start to formulate an argument on knowledge graphs and social networks, how they can be thought together. When the World Wide Web was introduced in the early 1990s as a system of hypertext where you browse connected information through links, museums quickly realized the value of their collections in this context. At the Museum Collections and the Information Superhighway Conference in 1995, David Behrman proposed, if the cultural heritage community could exploit the power of multiple independent authority files as knowledge bases, they would enable the intellectual integration of museum object information with information resources created by others. And he continues, the linkage of such information resources would support natural language searching beyond the words in a text and the cascading of complex retrieval strategies across databases. End of quote. By others, by the word others, he seems to primarily refer to other institutions providing, for example, I quote, census data, environmental information, or geophysical data, end of quote. So fast forward again to the 2010s and the question of the social web. Is there a way to return to this vision of linked searchable databases? And how can resources be linked beyond this idea of institutional data sets to actually allow contributions by others? The only major social network connecting linked data with community functionality is Wikidata. Now, you might find the wiki style a bit outdated in the world of responsive design and dynamic visualization dashboards. It clearly looks old school, but I still would say it's still the best model we have for large scale cooperation on linked data. And it actually works since quite some time with a success story of 10 years, roughly the same time span as Instagram, but a completely different social technology online. So let me explain why I think this is the key aspect, this being a different kind of social technology based on collaborative data work. In 2018, the Metropolitan Museum added subject information to its artworks through a combined effort of artificial intelligence routines and 200 volunteers working on this data, which was then published for further use and reworking to Wikidata. This Wikidata graph is from the project's presentation at the Museum Computer Network conference in 2019. So just imagine that this style becomes a more widespread style of social media, debating cultural heritage by describing it, by writing it in a networked way. The graph model does not only allow for enrichment on one aspect, like it was done here with the subject information and the tagging, but can expand in various directions and even contain competing interpretations and contextualizations. Basically, I would say this is the fitting data model for the current debates on a more democratic and more social museum. So this means from the ICOM definition debate to concepts of socio-museology and the democratic museum. So while I agree with Dominic Oldman about how the data models of museums should allow for more complexity, I wanted to show how close we can bring the idea of social networks and this complex networked data. And I will end with some practical examples. Last year, I was part of a team that developed a community archiving software called COACHI, Community-Oriented Archive Interface, which allows to work together on a visual graph by providing a three-part interface form for elements and relations. So you directly write in text the nodes and edges of your network. The open source prototype, which with code and documentation in the demo, is released on coachi.net. Other tools like Graph Commons allow for editing a graph together with a linked with a digital pen. So you draw the nodes and edges directly into the graph. What happens in both cases with COACHI and Graph Commons is that context and linked data becomes something visual which can be directly contributed to. So I hope by defining these technologies like Wikidata or these graph interfaces as social networks, we can shift the focus from the corporate feed networks like Facebook, Instagram, etc., to more interesting technologies for a future social web. Which brings me to my conclusion. So let's believe for a moment that Facebook will be regulated, split up, or become too boring to log in. And Instagram and TikTok will drown in their own repetitive toxic image worlds and become also deserted by their users. And furthermore, that people won't buy the next proposal the next current proposal that immersive 3D office hours and social time and virtual reality are a nice way to spend many hours of your day, or that treating your data like financial assets is a good thing to do. So I'm referring to the so-called metaverse and cryptocurrencies. In such a situation, let's say all this happens, then all the long-term debates in the museum sector on open data standards and the new debates represented by last year's conference contribution about data modeling and social justice movements, they will gain a bigger and larger social relevancy. Joanne McNeill, in her book about users, proposes a new role of pre-internet institutions like libraries and describes them as social hubs which could gain a new role online, namely taking care of heritage data and helping people relate to it. She writes, "A public internet alone won't save us. A decentralized internet itself won't protect us. More than that, what users need are non-commercial, localized systems of feedback, mutual aid, and accountability. Commons guided with respect to user consent and privacy." So I want to end with this quote because this quote also underlines for me that the future social web is not about NFTs, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other concepts of financialization, decentralization, or libertarianism. These problematic ideas which are currently pushed in the discussions about the politics of the internet. The future social web has nothing to do with the current rebranding of surveillance capitalism as the metaverse or the rebranding of cryptocurrencies as the Web3. For museums, this means don't believe the hype, continue to build open infrastructures for public culture. This is about linked open data and about democratic collaboration. So the ethical challenges around social aspects of heritage data remain, see last year's talk. They are just embedded in a bigger picture of what kind of digital communication we envision for museums and the public. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.